In Spanish, whenever you want to say that you know someone or that you know something, you have a tricky choice between the Spanish verbs saber versus conocer. As a Spanish teacher, I often find that the most common mistakes that we hear with these two Spanish verbs aren't what you expect. The mistakes tend to be related to sentence structure as opposed to which verb to use and when. That said, in this video, you're going to learn the meaning of saber versus conocer. When should we use saber? When should we use conocer? You're going to learn about sentence structure. How should we use these two Spanish verbs in a sentence? You're going to learn about the similarities. Are these two verbs interchangeable? And if so, when? And finally, you're going to learn what are the most common mistakes that we hear with these two Spanish verbs. If you want to learn how to master saber y conocer in Spanish, then keep watching. Vamos! So let's start off with the meaning of saber y conocer and how you can think about these two Spanish verbs in relation to English verbs. So for starters, saber can mean to know. And we use saber when we want to talk about knowing facts, information, or how to do something. So when it comes to facts or information, you can think of saber as the verb to use when answering questions in general. For example, if I was going to ask you, do you know how many people live in Spain? This in Spanish would be, ¿sabes cuántas personas viven en España? ¿Sabes cuántas personas viven en España? Now, as a Spanish teacher, I could often ask a question like, in that last sentence, we had to use saber. Do you know why? This in Spanish would be, ¿y sabes por qué? ¿Y sabes por qué?
¿Y sabes por qué?
Now, as another example, imagine you were to ask someone a question that they weren't really allowed to answer. They could respond by saying, you know I'm not allowed to answer that. This in Spanish would be, ¿sabes que no puedo contestarte a eso? ¿Sabes que no puedo contestarte a eso?
¿Sabes que no puedo contestarte a eso?
Now, imagine you give a gift to someone and you would like to know what their first impressions are. You could ask this in Spanish by saying, Me gustaría saber cuáles son tus primeras impresiones. Me gustaría saber cuáles son tus primeras impresiones.
Me gustaría saber cuáles son tus primeras impresiones.
All right, now let's look at the meaning of conocer and how we can think about this verb in relation to English verbs. So conocer could also be translated as to know. But this is where one of the main problems lies with saber versus conocer. Instead, it's better to think of conocer as to be familiar with, to get to know, or to meet, or to have met. And we use this verb with people, places, and things. That's why it's sometimes better to think of conocer as to have met or to be familiar with to help remind yourself that we need this verb to talk about people, places, and things. Now, as an interesting example, imagine you're watching a sci-fi movie or a rom-com or something like that, and the narrator comes over the top and says, to explain what the protagonist is about to do, you're going to meet a girl, a waitress. This in Spanish would be, vas a conocer a una chica, una camarera. Y vas a conocer a una chica, una camarera.
Y vas a conocer a una chica, una camarera.
Now, in this example, we're talking about meeting a person. You're going to meet a girl, a waitress. In contrast, we can also use conocer to talk about places. And as an interesting example, imagine you were doing something like a travel vlog and you want to explain that the people that are going to take you on this tour know the way perfectly well. You could express this in Spanish by saying, ellos ya conocen perfectamente bien el camino. Ellos ya conocen perfectamente bien el camino.
Ellos ya conocen perfectamente bien el camino.
Now, another really interesting use of conocer and a slightly different sentence structure, which I'm going to cover in more detail in the next section on using these two verbs in a sentence. But as a quick example now, we can say something like, when we met each other, or you and I, we met that way. Maybe if you're talking about an interesting way of meeting, you could say, you and I met that way. This in Spanish would be, tú y yo nos conocimos así. Tú y yo nos conocimos así.
Tú y yo nos conocimos así.
So the next thing we're going to look at is how to use saber y conocer in a Spanish sentence. Whenever you're considering how to use a Spanish verb in a sentence, you always need to think about two things. How does the verb change? E.g., what happens with the conjugations? And then are there any other words we should be using with these verbs? E.g., should we have any objects or should we be using any prepositions? Well, firstly, what are the conjugations for saber y conocer? Both of these two verbs are quite irregular, and starting with saber, we have yo sé, I know. Tú sabes, you know. Él o ella sabe, he or she knows. Nosotros sabemos, we know. Ellos saben, they know. For conocer, yo conozco, I am familiar with. Tú conoces, you are familiar with. Él o ella conoce, he or she is familiar with. Nosotros conocemos, we are familiar with. Ellos conocen, they are familiar with. Now, what is the best way to learn conjugations in Spanish? Often when you get a big long list like this, you think there's a lot to learn. Well, what I always recommend students do is always just start with the I form and the you form, because these two are the most important when it comes to being conversational in Spanish. Not only that, but if you have the I form and the you form, then for 99% of the verbs in Spanish, you'll be able to work out the rest of the conjugation just by following some simple patterns. So for these two verbs, we have yo sé, tú sabes, sé, sabes, or yo conozco, tú conoces. Conozco, conoces. So the next thing we need to look at, do we need to use any other words in a sentence with these two Spanish verbs? Well, let's start with saber. And the answer is yes. We definitely need to think about some other words we potentially have to use in combination with saber. So let's look at a few examples. For starters, imagine someone asked you a question and you wanted to simply say, well, I don't know. You want to say you don't know the answer to something. You could simply say in Spanish, pues no sé. Pues no sé.
Pues no sé.
And while we can actually say it like this, it's actually really common in Spanish to use the word lo, which means it, when answering a question you don't know. So instead of pues no sé, you could say something along the lines of, en verdad, no lo sé. En verdad, no lo sé.
En verdad no lo sé.
And this kind of translates in a really strange way between English and Spanish. It kind of means, actually, I don't know it. Now, we don't tend to talk like that in English. We don't say, I don't know it. But maybe to help remember this, you can think about it as, I don't know that. I don't know that. Because it's really common to say this in Spanish. No lo sé. Now, as another example, this is even stranger again, a really common way to say you don't know something, to answer a question that you're just not sure about, you can actually say, yo que sé. Yo que sé.
Yo qué sé.
Now, this sentence is difficult to translate between English and Spanish because it's quite idiomatic. This means we need to learn it as a phrase. You can't think I, that, no. It just sort of doesn't work. So you need to just think yo que sé means I don't know. So while the most comfortable translation of I don't know for you is probably going to be no sé, I encourage you to try to branch out a little bit and try no lo sé, because it sometimes sounds even more natural. And then if you're feeling really adventurous, try to say yo que sé. Just test it out, see how that goes in your next Spanish conversation. Now, another thing to keep in mind with saber is that the third use of saber is for saying that you know how to do something. Now, the temptation is to use the word como in combination with saber. So, for example, I know how to swim. A lot of students might be tempted to say, yo sé cómo nadar. But in Spanish, it is much more common to drop the como and actually say, yo sé nadar. Yo sé nadar. And if you wanted to ask someone, you could simply say, do you know how to swim? Sabes nadar. Sabes nadar. Now, as another example, imagine you are interviewing a famous actor that's sort of got a bit of a reputation for always being busy. You might want to ask a question like, do you know how to be still, or do you know how to be stationary? This in Spanish is sabes estar parado. And with a strong accent, you often might drop the D. You could say, sabes estar parado.
¿Sabes estar parado?
Now that we've looked at some of the intricacies of using saber in a Spanish sentence, let's next have a look at the uses of conocer and how we need to think about using this verb in Spanish. Well, thinking back to one of the translations to English from before, a really good use of conocer is to say to have met. So imagine you want to ask someone, have you met my friend? The best way to do this in Spanish is to say, ¿conoces a mi amigo? ¿Conoces a mi amigo? Now, working closely with students over the years, I know that there are a number of students that have got annoyed by this particular example because they're thinking in English it's to have met, which is kind of a past tense, but in Spanish it tends to be in the present. Now, while doing some research for this video, I found a really great example that sort of demonstrates this point. I actually found an extract of the television show Have You Met My Mother dubbed into Spanish. So the original scene for you in English goes as follows.
Have you met Ted?
No, we're not playing Have You Met Ted?
Hi, have you met Ted?
So here we've got this past example. Have you met Ted? Now in the dubbed Spanish version, this is the way it went.
¿Conoces a Ted? No vamos a jugar a conoces a Ted.
Hola, ¿conoces a Ted?
So we have conoces a Ted. So again in English we've got have you met Ted? And in Spanish we've got the present tense. Conoces a Ted. So again, this just demonstrates that when it comes to just asking in general, if you've met someone, the most natural way to do this in Spanish is using the present tense, conoces. So the next most obvious question is, when should we be using conocer in the past to say that we've met someone? Well, the answer is that we want to use conocer in the past when we want to specifically provide a date or time when we met the person, not if we've met them in general. So for example, I might want to say, if someone asks me, when did you meet your wife? I might want to say, well, I met her in 2003. This in Spanish would be la conocí en 2003. La conocí en 2003. Now, as another example to use conocer like a reciprocal verb, if you're having a discussion with your friend or with your partner, you might want to say something like when we first met. Do you remember? This in Spanish would be como cuando nos conocimos, ¿te acuerdas? Como cuando nos conocimos, ¿te acuerdas?
Como cuando nos conocimos, ¿te acuerdas?
All right, so now that we've looked at how saber y conocer behave in a Spanish sentence, the next thing we need to look at is whether these two verbs are interchangeable. Now, the short answer to this question is no. We need to use saber and conocer in slightly different contexts. But there are a few situations that can tend to cause a lot of challenges for Spanish students, and I get a lot of questions about this idea of asking whether you know someone famous. So for example, imagine you want to ask someone, do you know the famous Spanish actor Javier Bardem? So the question you need to ask yourself is, should you be using saber or should we be using conocer? Now, before we translate this question into Spanish, it can help to rephrase this question in English first to help make the answer more obvious. So if we start with a question, do you know Javier Bardem? We could rephrase this to, do you know who Javier Bardem is? And are you familiar with Javier Bardem? Now with these sentences, and hopefully from what we've already covered so far in the video, you will have already figured out which question we need to use for saber and which question we need to use for conocer. So of course the translation of do you know who Javier Bardem is into Spanish is ¿sabes quién es Javier Bardem? And are you familiar with Javier Bardem is ¿conoces a Javier Bardem? Now, to provide another example of where we can kind of use saber and conocer interchangeably, provided we rearrange the structure of the sentence, you can think of a situation where imagine you want to go up to someone that you've never met, a stranger on the street, because you want to ask them a question. We could say something like, we don't know each other, but... So this in Spanish would be something like, hola, no nos conocemos, pero... Hola, no nos conocemos, pero... Or what we could do is we could reframe this question. Instead of we don't know each other, you could say, you don't know who I am. This in Spanish, you could say something like, hola, tú no sabes quién soy, pero. Hola, tú no sabes quién soy, pero.
Hola. Tú no sabes quién soy, pero...
Right, now the last thing we need to look at in this video is what are some of the most common mistakes that students tend to make with saber and conocer. And there are 3 mistakes that you need to think about. The first mistake, which I tend to hear, or as teachers we tend to hear at Real Fast Spanish, some of our students making, has to do with the conjugations. So the first thing that you'll notice with saber and conocer is that they're both quite irregular in the first person. So what tends to happen is students might forget that I know with saber is yo sé, or I am familiar with conocer is yo conozco. So the first thing you need to practice is yo sé, yo conozco, because again, these two are quite irregular as far as Spanish verbs go. The next most common mistake, and the one that I really want you to think about after watching this video, and I really want you to remember and try and get it right, is using the personal a when asking if you are familiar with someone. So in Spanish, you really need to say, conoces a and then the person you're referring to. This is quite unusual because we don't really have an equivalent of the personal a in English. And I'm going to do a whole video talking about this one particular concept. But whenever we've got a person that we're referring to specifically, then we need to use the personal a whenever we're referring to them as the object of a sentence. So whenever you want to use conocer, conoces a to ask someone, have you met or are you familiar with? Then simply think, for example, have you met my friend? ¿Conoces a mi amigo? Have you met my father? ¿Conoces a mi padre? Have you met my friend from work or my work colleague? ¿Conoces a mi compañero de trabajo? Now, in contrast, whenever we're talking about have you been to a place or are you familiar with a place, then we don't need this personal a, we don't need this preposition. So for example, do you know Madrid? Have you been to Madrid? ¿Conoces Madrid? Are you familiar with Buenos Aires? Or have you been to Buenos Aires? ¿Conoces Buenos Aires? And then the last common error that students tend to make is mixing up saber and conocer in the context of do you know a famous person or do you know a famous place, as we covered in the end of the previous section. So just to provide one more example, to mention a famous restaurant, a restaurant that I went to and visited and covered in our video where we went to the Dominican Republic, there's this famous sandwich restaurant that Anthony Bourdain went to called Barra Payan.
This is the thing. Now look at the layers. You see the pork? Right. You got tomato, you got ham.
Now, if you wanted to ask someone in Spanish if they are familiar with Barra Payan, then you would want to say, ¿Conoces Barra Payan? All right, so this covers a lot of the intricacies and things you need to know about saber y conocer. So do you have any questions? Was there anything in this video that wasn't clear? Or is there anything that you would like me to cover in an upcoming video? If so, leave a comment below. If you like this video, then give it a thumbs up. And if you're not already subscribed, then please subscribe. Also, if you want more tips like this, we have a weekly newsletter called Español de la Semana. To sign up for the weekly newsletter, I'll leave a link below in the description. All right, so on that note, thanks so much for watching. Gracias por ver, and I'll speak with you soon. Hasta pronto.